Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Parallels, which is episode 11 of season 7 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek Next Generation one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 7th season episode Parallels. So Parallels is the episode in which Worf returns from a Bat'leth tournament to find that things start to get out of whack. He noticed people moving and being in different positions or wearing different clothes all of a sudden, and Cardassian ship, apparently there was evidence that was tampering with the Argus array, and then that evidence disappears, but no one except for Worf seems to notice, and they don't really believe him until the changes starting to get really bad and uncontrollable. And then finally, they do an investigation with Data, and apparently now Troi is Worf's wife, which came out of nowhere. But once they investigate, Data discovers that Worf is not from their universe, that he is in fact hopping from universe to parallel universe to parallel universe, which is triggered by Geordi's visor. So every time Geordi came near him, he got pushed into a different parallel universe. And so they go back to the anomaly that caused the problem in the first place and come up with a plan to return Worf to his universe. However, the Bajorans, the evil Bajorans in this parallel universe, attack the Enterprise while they are scanning the anomaly, and that causes it to malfunction, and a whole bunch of freaking thousands of Enterprises from all these different parallel universes start entering this universe. And so they realize the only way to fix it is to get the original shuttlecraft from Worf's universe and have him go in that shuttle and fix the fissures. So they contact the correct Enterprise, get them to send the shuttle, and Worf manages to fix the timeline, and he goes back to the point where he first entered the anomaly and is back in his own universe. So, this is a classic. It's funny, I always remember having this on my countdown somewhere quite high, and I got a comment saying, yeah, people don't like that episode. But then I looked it up on IMDb, and it was like, it might have been top 10. It was at least top 20 of IMDb, and I'm like, no, you're wrong. People do like this episode. Maybe you don't like it, but it's very clear that this is a fan favorite. I've heard the opinion repeatedly over and over again saying that other than All Good Things, this is the best episode of season 7. I've heard that opinion tons of time. One that I wouldn't even go that far. My second favorite episode of season 7 is actually Preemptive Strike, but this might be my third, I think. So one thing I have to mention, I want to start out by mentioning, because I saw this, actually I watched several reviews, and several of them don't like. It was more than one or two people, it might have been 3 or 4 people, who didn't really understand what was happening to the other Worfs from the other parallel universe. So when Worf jumped to a parallel universe, someone surmised that he would like override that Worf and kill him. And then they were like, when at the end, the Riker, Captain Riker on the Enterprise contacts Worf's original Enterprise, and you see another Worf in the background, and they're like very confused by that. So let me explain this, because I'm confused that they're confused. I'm surprised that they don't get this. I thought it was pretty self-evident. I got it from the very beginning. First time I ever saw this episode is that. So our main character Worf, he's patient 0. He's the one that went through the anomaly. So that's why, in order to fix it at the end, it has to be him with the original shuttle from his universe going to repair the anomaly. So he is patient 0. He's the one that went through the anomaly. And whenever he jumped to another parallel universe, there would be like a cascade effect, where the Worf from that universe would jump to the next one, and the Worf from that universe would jump to the next one, and the Worf from that, like it would push the Worf, so they would like trade places, and it would be like a huge like domino effect where the Worfs would be jumping with each other every time our Worf jumped. And I think that's evident from the fact when a couple times when Worf jumps, like particularly when he's doing the investigation with Data, is that the characters who are already in that universe already know about Worf having the problems. They're already investigating it because the Worf was already jumping, so there was already a different Worf in that universe. And when our Worf jumped into that universe, that pushed that different Worf into a different universe. If you know what I'm saying, I thought that was quite evident. I was surprised that so many people were confused by this. So that when they call the other Enterprise or our Enterprise, the Prime Enterprise, when they call our Enterprise, and there's another Worf there, like that's not surprising because that's a Worf from a different universe who got shoved into that one. And that's why they weren't too surprised. If you notice, like Picard was saying, yes, our Mr. Data figured that out already because they already knew about this. They were already investigating this. In fact, that is why all those Enterprises are by that anomaly in the first place, because they were already investigating it, because they came to the same conclusion that they did because there was different Worfs. So you could actually do a different story where instead of following Worf on this journey as he jumps from universe to universe to universe, you could have done an alternate story perspective of this episode where it just stayed with our Enterprise the entire time, and so you get it from like everyone else's perspective where they see Worf, all these different Worfs jumping in their universe, and every time he's confused and doesn't know what is going on, is like, what's going on? Why am I married to Counselor Troi? Or why? What are you talking about? The Cardassians are enemies and the Bajorans are our friends. Like, this should be. You could do it the other like perspective where it's just Worf keeps changing to a different person all the time, because that's what's happening in every single universe. There's multiple Worfs jumping. I thought that was quite self-evident. I was surprised people didn't get that. And no, like, so the opinion I heard that when Worf was killing the other Worf, they misinterpreted a line from Counselor Troi where she said, and from what I understand, there's a good chance that my Worf isn't going to return. She wasn't saying that, so people misinterpret that to mean, she knows that the Worf is killing the other, that her Worf is dead. That's not what she's saying. She's saying if, this Worf goes back to his own universe, that doesn't mean that her Worf is going to return to her universe, as far as she knows. Like, they don't know that. They didn't know until the very end when he went in to reset the anomaly fracture that it would reset everything. Now, Data did say that, but Troi had her line before Data figured that out, so she wasn't sure if her Worf would ever return. She didn't think he was dead. She just wasn't sure if he'd ever return to her universe. But as it stands, everything got reset. And I heard another opinion, like way back in the day when this episode first came out, because in the trailer for this episode, the promo for this episode, they had showed the scene at the end where there was like multiple Worfs. So it was like 6 or 7 different Worfs in the shuttle. And I heard this one guy say, this episode was a rip. I was expecting to see multiple Worfs all the time, but we only got in one 5-second scene. And I was like, that's all I expected. Like, I don't know why you had that expectation. Like, the rest of the trailer did not give the impression the whole episode was going to be about a shitload of Worfs. It was just one brief shot. So I wasn't the least bit surprised when it was just one brief shot. So anyway, yeah, so I thought I'd clear that up because I thought that was obvious, but that's just me. I don't know, maybe there's some people who are going to argue with me saying that's not the case, but I thought that was very clearly the case. But anywho, I will say that this episode, this is an episode, again, that doesn't maybe age as well as some other episodes, because, to be fair, When this episode first came out, it was very novel. In fact, I was just watching a commentary with Brennan Braga talking about how this was such a fresh new idea and something that like mainstream science fiction TV and television and movies hadn't really covered before. But he pointed out that there'd been a lot of stuff similar that came out after this. However, that commentary is from nearly 10 years ago. So there's even more stuff that's came out in the past 10 years, namely all the Marvel multiverse stuff. In fact, I was watching a reaction video that was made just a couple months ago, where this woman was watching this episode, and she immediately got, oh, this is multiverse stuff, and she wasn't familiar with Star Trek, only saw like a scattering of episodes, and was watching this episode for the first time, but instantly got it mainly from Marvel stuff. She was like, oh, this is the multiverse. And there's been other, the whole Spider-Man cartoons, and there's been other things that, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness and all this stuff. So the multiverse thing is actually kind of mainstream, and I thought that was interesting that she caught on to this, because back in the day when this episode first aired, most people had no idea what the fuck was going on. Now, avid Star Trek fans like myself got it immediately because of Mirror Mirror and stuff like that. But this was before even Sliders came out. That came out after this. So this was very novel at the time. This was a very, unique concept, where nowadays it's actually quite common, especially with the Marvel stuff. So it's not as novel as it used to be. So this is what I mean by it doesn't age as well. But I still like it, and it's still unique to an extent, because. And yeah, there's been some other parallel universe. There's been tons of TV shows that done one-off episodes about parallel universes that came out. A lot of sci-fi shows. It's almost like a staple. Like every sci-fi show has to have at least one parallel universe story, like Stargate SG-1, Farscape, all this stuff. I think Babylon 5 did one, if I remember correctly. I don't know. I'm not too sure about that one. The B5 fan might have to correct me. And then the Fringe, had that as being their main serialized story, revolving around a parallel universe that lasted 2 seasons, at least 2 seasons. And then it turned into an alternate timeline thing. But alternate timelines are different than parallel universes. Like Yesterday's Enterprise, for example, was an alternate timeline episode, not a parallel universe episode. So the difference is the alternate timeline is directly caused by a time travel. Like time travel causes an alternate timeline, whereas a parallel universe just exists. It's already there. Then there's tons of them, as this episode points out. And I was watching this review where they referred to the science. Come on, they referred to the science in this episode as gobbledygook. But others have actually pointed out that this is actually based off of real theoretical theories. Like there's theories out there, at least there were in the 90s when this episode was made, about the multitude of parallel universes, that for every decision that's made, there's a different universe where that decision happened. And if you ever read the book Q Squared, which is a Star Trek book written by Peter David, I used to love. It used to be my favorite Star Trek book back in the day. They had a line in that book with because it was taking place in the parallel universe where Jack Crusher never died, and he was the captain of the Enterprise, and I think Picard was his first officer. And there was a line in there, I think it was Q was talking to Jack Crusher about the or maybe it was Picard, I don't know. Someone was talking to Jack Crusher about the possibility of parallel universe, and he was like, I don't buy that there's a universe out there for every single decision I made. Like if I decided to have, apple pie after dinner, and one time I didn't, He didn't eat the apple pie. That doesn't seem like that's the basis of an entire universe. And Q, or whoever it was, I think it was Q, pointed out that, there's not a universe for every single minute decision ever made, but the important ones. Which is, I think, from what I understand, is also similar to what Marvel does. But that's they do the, I don't know. I'm a bit confused about Marvel, actually. If it's because the Loki show and the Avengers Endgame seem to suggest that it's alternate timelines that's caused by time travel. But then maybe, I don't know, Loki's contradictory on that. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about the MCU. I get stuck up on that. I think they're confused of whether or not it's parallel universe or time travels. But regardless, there is a distinction in Star Trek itself. But so I find the concept of Worf traveling to different universes that are very similar to his own. They're almost identical, but there's slight differences. And I think Sliders played off this a little bit too, to be very fascinating. And it was, as I said, original for the time. That, one time they said, oh, Picard couldn't make it to the party. Then all of a sudden he's there. And the cake was chocolate. Then all of a sudden it's vanilla. And the painting was on one wall. All of a sudden it moves. All of a sudden it turns into a different painting because he jumps into different universes. And I love the progression. How it starts out like very similar. Like the universes diverge more and more as it goes. And this is, alright, so getting back to the whole Worf thing, about how when he shifts, all the other Worfs shift, and it's like a domino, they're all shifting at the same time. Someone might ask, well, what if there's an Enterprise where Worf isn't on board? Well, in that case, that wouldn't be included in the shift. Then they wouldn't shift, and possibly, I'm not even sure if, it could be, the episode doesn't tackle this, but it could be, say, if there's a parallel universe where Worf is on a Klingon ship and never was raised by the Federation and was always a Klingon warrior, it could be a Worf from Starfleet would shift into that parallel universe and find himself on a Klingon ship, and the Klingon Worf would find himself on the Starfleet ship. But I don't know if that's the case, because what I think this episode makes clear is that the shift happens, or the adjacent universe that they shift to is one that's very similar to their own. And it starts to, as he shifts more and more, he gets further away. And plus, if there's a Worf that's not on the Enterprise, then Geordi wouldn't be there to cause the shifts. So, or I think it's just our main Worf who's the one that's causing the shifts. And so the other ones are just being dragged along with him. So that's why the shifts happen whenever Geordi goes close to him, because he's, as I said, patient zero. And he's the one that is stringing all the other Worfs. So whenever he jumps, he pushes the other Worfs into boom, 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 their different universes. And also, so someone else brought up the point of, well, Worf, there's a universe where Worf said he never went to the Batleth tournament, so how come he's shifting? And as I said, it doesn't matter what he did. It matters what our Worf did, because he's patient zero. He's the one causing the shifts. He's the one that caused the anomaly. That's why he needs to be the one to fix it. So the other ones are just being pushed by him. Which I think is a very interesting concept. Makes perfect sense to me. But anyway, I got back on that. But, it's interesting how they were doing slight differences. And it just kept getting progressively more different to the point you get to the universe that we stay with, because Geordi dies. And so he's no longer jumping. And the one we stay with is actually quite different, where Wesley's there, Riker's the captain because Picard died during the incident with the Borg, and the Bajorans are the enemies. I love these things. There's a Cardassian Starfleet officer at the helm. I love this, that's a really nice touch. I love that touch, that there's a parallel universe where the Bajorans overpowered the Cardassian. So what I understand when I can extrapolate from that line of Riker saying the Bajorans getting more hostile after they overpowered the Cardassian Empire, what I would extrapolate from that line is that in this parallel universe, the Bajorans were more militaristic and more well armed, and so when the Cardassians tried to occupy them, they were able to fight them off and fight back and prevent them from occupying them. And more than that, they were, incentivized. They were outraged that they even attempted to occupy them, and so they gained more power and more military might and went after them and ended up overpowering their empire. So I guess in this universe, the Cardassian Empire is probably weaker than it was in the prime timeline. And I'm thinking about that. From my perspective, I just watched the Lower Decks episode yesterday where they went to a parallel universe, and I love how they were making the jokes. I also brought up parallels in my review for that episode because it was also a similar universe. Is like not too crazily different, but somewhat different. Like Boimler had a joke about, let's go to a crazy universe where people have feet for hands or something like that. Like that's getting into that. What was that dumb movie that everyone else loves that I didn't like? Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'm sorry, but hot dogs for fingers, like, it makes me want to vomit every time I think about that. That's my own personal pet peeve. And Rick and Morty also had an episode like that where it had the parallel universe TV, like stuff like that, where it has the parallel universe be so out there and crazy, like the dude with bugs and ants in his eyes or something. Like, I have no interest in that, none whatsoever. And so I actually find stuff like this more interesting, where they go into universes, because that's just too crazy and it's just too out there and it just loses me. But stuff like this, when I have universes where it's similar but some key, like, minor differences, I think that's actually very interesting. That's a lot more interesting to me anyway. And so you get the universe where Riker's the captain, Wesley is still there, and Worf is the first officer, which it kind of plays off that line in Best of Both Worlds, where Riker said he considered Worf a first officer, which makes no sense, because why would you skip over Data, who's next in line? But apparently in this universe he did, for some reason. My headcanon was that Data, something happened with him and Maddox kind of blocked his entry to the Academy. You know how Maddox was trying to block his entry to the Academy? That actually worked for a while, but Data eventually was able to overcome it. But because of that, he didn't enter into Starfleet Academy until years later, and so he graduated later, so he was only a lieutenant and Worf was lieutenant commander, because in this universe he actually entered the Academy earlier, and so that's why he was promoted. And now by the time that we get to this episode, Data got promoted to lieutenant commander, but before he was just a lieutenant and he wasn't the second officer, Worf was. That's my headcanon, although I'm just making this shit up. I absolutely am. But I'm doing this to satisfy myself, because I don't want to think that Worf just skipped over Data, because that makes no fucking sense. But this is a parallel universe, so all that shit I just made up, you don't know that's not what happened. That could be the case. It could very much be the case. But anyway, I know it's just my headcanon, but just let me have this. This is the way I can enjoy the episode better. But anyway, and I love that. So this universe is way different than many of the other universes we saw Worf jump into, and as I said, it seems to be getting progressively different. But I love that, but it's still very similar. it's still not all. It doesn't have people with ant in their eyes or hot dogs for fingers or any bullshit like that. It's still along the same lines as their universe. But yeah, that scene where the Bajorans, I love that, by the way. I love that different aspect. This is what's so interesting about this episode, is that it boggles your mind. Like, it really gets your mind activated. It really gets it thinking. And especially when the Bajorans attack and all these different enterprises appear, like that, I remember being so blown, like my mouth flew open. I remember being so amazed. And again, this is something that maybe doesn't stand the test of time, because maybe now with all the multiverse bullshit that people wouldn't be as impressed with it. It's like, oh yeah, this is the multiverse. But for me, it was mind-blowing that they were actually doing like thousands of enterprises coming in. I love what Wesley's like, we're receiving like 2,800 hails or whatever it was. Which is kind of fun. And I wish we would have seen more of it. Like, I've heard the opinion that maybe this should have been a two-parter. But that would just be an indulgence, really. I mean, I guess they could maybe try to come up with a story to where we actually got to see those enterprises, but it did seem like it would be hard for them to do it without making it seem like they were purposely stretching the story out, because quite frankly, that's what they would be doing. Now, as much as I would love to see more of those different enterprises, it would be an indulgence. But, you know, sometimes indulgence isn't that bad of a thing. So maybe I wouldn't mind it being a two-parter, but that being said, it's not diminished, because like it doesn't take anything away from this episode. It's not diminished because it's only one part. It actually kind of makes more sense as being one part, actually. It's probably the more natural conclusion. It just would have been fun to indulge in all these different enterprises, because the one scene that Brennan Braga pointed this out in the commentary, he has commentary on the Blu-ray that I just watched, and the one scene that he pointed out as being the one that most fans talk about the most is the scene where we get the Riker from the other universe, where the Borg took over the Federation. He has a big bushy beard and he's attacking the shuttle saying, "The Borg are everywhere!" Like, they could have indulged in more shit like that, because that is fascinating, and I think it makes sense why people talk about that scene, because to imagine a universe where because we get the universe that Worf currently is in, like Picard died during the Borg attack, so it makes sense there would be another universe out there where the Borg actually win, because that was actually a strong possibility, and to see that the Riker, who was a character who's very sort of composed and a figure of rationality, to see there's a version of him who's completely like mad and crazy and like desperate and willing to destroy his shuttle so he doesn't have to go back to his own universe, is quite powerful. It's really thought-provoking. And it's scenes like that really get the imagination going. Another thing I wanted to talk about was the Worf's surprise party, and how the song that they sang was "He's a Jolly Good Fellow," and they interpreted translated it to Klingon. It's funny, the line where Troi says, "Oh, there's not a Klingon, that doesn't seem to be a Klingon word for jolly." But surely there's something similar to it, which I suppose there is. Maybe she just said that as a joke, because they did come up with a translation, because there are a lot of Klingons that are jolly, like Guinan pointed out to Worf, where he's like, "Klingons do not laugh." She's like, "Yeah, sure they do. You don't, but plenty. I've heard Klingon belly laughs that will make your toes curl or something like that." And we do see a lot of like Klingons at bars like laughing and singing those drinking songs and shit like that. So there are some Klingons that are jolly. Now, I can buy there's not a direct translation of jolly, because that is kind of a weird word, but there would be an approximation. I'm sure there's that way with other real-life languages. I'm not a language expert, so I wouldn't know. Maybe something like Chinese or something like that, where there isn't a direct translation to jolly, but there's probably an approximation, meaning happy, jocular, or whatever, and you can just throw that in. Surely it's the same with Klingon. Surely that's what they did. But anyway, he's a jolly good fellow, as I knew, and Brennan Braga pointed out in the commentary, that the reason why they were singing He's a Jolly Good Fellow and not Happy Birthday is because He's a Jolly Good Fellow was free. It was in public domain, whereas Happy Birthday was copyrighted. Like somebody copyrighted, was it Warner Music Group? I'm looking it up right now. I think it was. I don't know. Somehow they were able to copyright the song Happy Birthday, and so they would have had to pay something like $20,000 just to use that song. And so a lot of, have you ever noticed, like, I started, once I heard about this, I would notice this a lot in movies. Like, if you ever see the movie Liar Liar with Jim Carrey, I've seen it dozens of times just because I was working at the movie theater when it came out. But there was, they were at a kid's birthday party, and there was a clown singing, and he goes, happy, 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 I'm so happy today. Like, they would do all these things to try to get around the fact that they couldn't use Happy Birthday because it was, and doing He's a Jolly Good Fellow makes a lot of sense. Because I didn't even notice, because it makes total sense that they'd be singing that kind of song. However, Brennan Braga said in the commentary, to this day, it is still copyrighted. Now, that might have been true when he made that commentary, because I believe it was recorded in like 2015 or something like that. However, I think I watched another review on this episode that said to this day it's copyrighted. But I think that review, I'm not entirely sure, and I had to look at it, but I think that review came out after 2016. And if it did, they're actually wrong, because I got it right here in Mr. Google. June 28th, 2016, the song was made public domain. So it's now free. Didn't used to be free back in the 90s or even up to 2016, but it is now. So I can now say happy birthday to you and not get copyrighted, because now it's public domain. So now I got to talk about Worf and Troi. Brennan Braga spent some time talking about that in the commentary. He said something that was really interesting, because he was saying how, I believe he said, if I remember correctly, he said Renee Echevarria and other people, but I think that was the name he mentioned. Other writers as well, but mentioned his name as wanting to put Riker and Troi together. And Michael Piller was against that, saying that he wanted to do something more original, and so he was the one pushing for Worf and Troi. And Rick Berman went along with him because, of course he would, because Rick Berman always goes along with any terrible ideas. Fuck that guy. But anyway, I said before how much I praise Michael Piller, and I think he's an amazing writer, and I think he was the heart and soul of Star Trek, the savior of Star Trek. But I also said I did not agree with every decision that he made, and this definitely falls into that category. That there's, just because he's not infallible, he's not perfect, there's definitely times where I strongly disagree with his creative decision, and this is definitely one of those times. I will say that I didn't mind the Worf and Troi relationship in this episode, because this is a parallel universe. And that's fine. Like, there could be a parallel universe when they're together. There could be a parallel universe where people have ants in their eyes. Like, so it doesn't really mean that. I still don't like that shit. But it doesn't really mean anything. So it didn't bother me too. I mean, they had that scene at the end when Worf returned to his own universe and he, like, asked Deanna to dinner, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they continued dating past that. So This episode's fine. Like, I didn't really have an issue with the Worf and Troi. Like, I didn't think it made the episode better, but it fit right into the theme of this is a weird parallel universe with weird shit going on. In fact, I love the scene, by the way, when Worf first finds out, when Troi walks into his quarters and goes to the bedroom and you see his head like peeking out the doorway. Like, that was funny. And then when she starts freaking out when she kisses him, saying, "I don't believe this is appropriate behavior," and she's like, "Even for your wife," and freaks out. Like, that was a good scene. So I do think it actually enhanced the episode a bit. I do think it worked for this episode because it's about parallel universe and weird shit happening in weird parallel universes. But they should have just left it here, just dropped it. And apparently they did have this idea in season 5 as well, and they were trying to foreshadow it in episodes like Ethics, but they never went through with it. And then here they finally got to it. And it's the episode Eye of the Beholder that actually brings it back in our universe. And although they have some imaginary telepathic flashbacks or whatever, but they do in the actual universe have a little bit of flirting between them. And in All Good Things, they established that they are in fact dating, which always was my least favorite aspect of All Good Things. As much as I love that, I think it's one of the best episodes of Star Trek, that was always the tiny little blemish on it, because they never should have done Worf and Data. Not Worf and Data, so that might have been interesting, actually, Worf and Data. No, Worf and Troi. They never should have done Worf and Troi. Yeah. And I think they had no chemistry. Now, granted, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as Chakotay 709, which is another. It's like all the three main 90s or Berman Trek or whatever you want to say. 90s, let's say 90s, because Enterprise wasn't 90s. But Voyager's finale came out in the 2000s, but close enough. But the three main 90s ones, they always had two characters they put in a romance for the finale. And TNG was Worf and Deanna, and DS9 it was Ezri and Bashir, and in Voyager it was Chakotay 709. And out of those three, Ezri Bashir is the only one I actually like, and I really like that, and I'll still fight people on that one because I know a lot of people don't like it, but I think that romance was brilliant. But this one's in the middle of those three, because the Chakotay 709 is easily the worst romance ever in between main characters in any Star Trek show ever in the existence of Star Trek. Not even Picard Season 2 did anything as bad as that. Like that, those characters were had no chemistry and was so odd together and just did not work at all. So I will be fair to the Worf and Troi thing, as at least it worked better than that. In fact, I would put Worf and Troi more on par with B'Elanna and Tom. And that one, they didn't give up, and they kept strangling and wouldn't give up on it. And so that's what makes it worse than the Worf and Troi, actually, because of the fact that they never dropped it, whereas the Worf and Troi thing, at least they were smart enough to drop it. And then put Troi where she belonged, with Riker. So I completely agree with Renee Echevarria and completely disagreed with Michael Piller. I think he was totally wrong on this one. In fact, they said, and Brennan Braga mentioned in his commentary, that they said that they thought it would be an interesting pairing because of the two most unlikely characters that you would think would fit together. But I actually disagree, because I think that's Troi and Data, who would have been a much better couple. The Treta, that's what I call it. I'm not calling it Doi, I'm calling it Treta. I think that would have been way better, the much better pairing. But anyway, that's not what they did, unfortunately. Didn't do the right thing. They did the wrong thing. Because Data is that's more of an odd couple in my opinion, because Data is emotionless and Troy's all about emotions. Whereas in Troi and Worf is just, all big, strong, tough guy, and Troi is more of the soft, touchy-feely, emotional one. But that actually seems to be a common pairing, actually, in real life. So it doesn't seem to be that much of an odd couple. But someone who's all about emotions being in a relationship with someone who's incapable of emotions, that would be a really interesting odd couple. And plus, like, I would buy that Deanna would want that kind of relationship because maybe she's sick of feeling other people's emotions. Maybe it's a novel thing for her to be with someone who she can't read. But anyway, it didn't happen. So I should just let it go. So Geordi died in this episode, and nobody seems to give a shit. That did always throw me off, to be honest. That did always be like, well, they're just standing over his dead body talking. Like, there was this one shot where Data looked kind of like shocked by the fact of hearing Geordi's dead, but then they just drop it. Now, I get it, that's not what the episode's about, and plus they knew that this is all going to be wiped by the end of the episode anyway. Like, no one watching this episode thinks he's remaining dead. But, still, they could have at least showed some more, like, distraught or emotion. The fact that no one seemed to give a shit. Poor Geordi, like, they really mistreat him. And we get the return of the Argus Array in this episode. It took me a while to realize that this was meant to be the exact same array from the Nth Degree. I thought they were just using the same prop or the same model, but it was supposed to be a different array. But no, it's the same one, Argus Array. I never knew it was by the Cardassian border, but here it is. So that was a nice little Easter egg. Brennan Braga mentioned the commentary was done to save money, but whatever, that's fine. I don't mind like continuity to save money. And he also talked about in the commentary how they used the Cardassians because they wanted to develop them more for like Deep Space Nine and make them more of a big thing. But he said that he never really got a handle on the Cardassians, and the way he wrote him in this episode was just a generic bad guy. He's like, well, I guess it could fit into their culture about them worrying about being spied on. But but that's fine, like, because they're not a major component. Like, you could have easily switched them out for the Romulans or any other bad guy, but they work fine. Like, and if they want to use Cardassians more often, you can tell season 6 and 7, especially season 7, they are going out of their way to use them more. Not just for Deep Space Nine's sake, but also set up the premise of the Maquis and Voyager. So that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. And also it was interesting, I believe they had the same actor who played the Cardassian Gull come back and play the Starfleet crew member at the end of the show, which was a nice touch. I did like that. I did appreciate that. So, I would now like to thank all my Patreon supporters for supporting me on Patreon. Is very much appreciated. Just help me continue with the channel. I want to give a big special thanks to Jordan Johnson, Antarius, and Brandon Neal House. Thank you also very, very much for your strong support. And I also want to give a shout out to Benjamin Mead, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Michelacero, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kinney, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we have a few Patreon comments on this episode. First comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, so my rating is 8.5. I'm amazed you haven't reviewed this episode yet. Brennan Braga wrote this episode. Did he get the idea to write all good things from this episode, as it's kind of similar in the way? Like Picard, no one seemed to believe Worf at first until Data started to talk to Worf. Data, I am detecting no temporal anomalies in the system. Perhaps we should try to pinpoint the exact moment when events became discontinuous. Do you remember the first change? Like Picard moving past, present, and future in time, Worf was quantum leaping into other worlds. I don't buy Worf winning a Batless competition as he lost so many fights on TNG, even a barrel beat him. He became a better fighter on Deep Space Nine. The Borg are the best in the episode. Maybe in the other universe they sent more than one cube at the Battle of Wolf 359 out of 10. P.S. I watched Preemptive Strike and I do apologize for its length and I did cut it down, but it's very long. P.S. 2. I am positive about a certain character in my next comment. I hope that may make up for the length of my Preemptive Strike comment. So, one thing I want to point out, which I have pointed out in other videos, is that Brannon Braga didn't come up with the idea for All Good Things. Michael Piller did. Now, I mentioned that before, and someone was like, oh, but he doesn't have a writing credit. It was written by Brannon Braga and Ronald D. Moore. But he was the showrunner, so he came up with ideas, and he did a lot of uncredited rewrites. Even though his name's down in the credits, that doesn't mean he wasn't involved in writing it, because he was involved in writing every script. Well, not for season 6 and 7 because he was over in Deep Space Nine. It was more of Jerry Taylor for season 6 and 7, but he was a part. He would still do some of season 7, especially the big finale. And how I know this, how I know he came up with an idea, is because he said it himself in several interviews. He said that he came up with the idea of doing All Good Things when he was doing yoga, because the yoga teacher was talking about being in touch with your past, present, and future self. And so that's what gave him the idea to have Picard jumping around in line. So he took it to the writer's room, workshopped it, passed it by the other writers. They're like, maybe he did, this is what we're doing. Maybe he didn't give them an option. Maybe he did. I have no idea. I wasn't in the writer's room. But according to him, unless you think he's a liar, which I don't know why you would, he's the one that came up with the idea. And he shopped it around in the writer's room and then and they worked it out and hammered it down and assigned it to Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga to actually write it. So that's why they have the writing credit, which I don't understand how a lot of people don't seem to understand that. That's how a lot of writers' rooms work. And in present day, they're starting to kill the writer's room, which a lot of writers, this is part of what they struck against. I think you would call it striked. It's why they went on strike. Part of the reason, AI and all that other shit too, and not getting paid enough, but also that modern day televisions were taking the writer's room away from them and making them write independently by themselves. But back in this day, that's not how it was done. It wasn't done like one writer sitting at the computer writing the whole thing, coming up with the idea. It was done in a writer's room with all the staff writers, and they would get any freelancers who were working on that particular episode in, and they'd workshop it with all of the different writers. And Michael Piller, as the showrunner, would have final say on what the story would be like, which means sometimes he would come up with the story idea. Now, the reason why I bring this up isn't so much of your comment, Stephen Kennedy, but it's because I got a comment on a video where my Michael Piller video, where I explained what I just explained about how he was involved in writing a lot of episodes, even though he doesn't have a writing credit. And so that comment I got told me, I can't believe you would say this bullshit, or how could you, this is the dumbest bullshit I've ever heard. And I didn't. So I wanted to respond to that comment. Now, I wasn't going to be rude or anything, but I was just going to calmly explain, like, look, you can go do any research, read any book about the writing of Star Trek, listen to any interviews, watch the DVD or the Blu-ray features about writing, listen to the writers themselves. They all confirm how the writer's room worked and how they workshopped and everything. And they point out, quite frankly, how Rene Echevarria, when he was doing this podcast with Cirque Laughlin, and he was talking about the episode The Offspring, he flat out mentioned, like, this episode was rewritten. Like, he's the credited writer. You look at the writing credit, it says written by Rene Echevarria. But he said that his original idea barely showed up on screen, that it was Melinda Snodgrass and Michael Piller who rewrote the entire thing. It's mainly their episode, but they're not credited on the episode because they were kind enough to not take credit for it and let Renee Echevarria take the credit for it, even though they essentially rewrote the whole thing. And it was only the bare bones of what Renee Echevarria originally wrote remained, but they were still kind enough to let him keep the credit. And that's quite common. In the TV setting, it was very collaborative in the writer's room, and they would talk about they would sit around the room with the blackboards or whatever. You can see this on the Deep Space Nine documentary where they break down the theoretical season 8, like when you see them sitting in the room and all workshopping ideas, like that's how they worked. You can see other documentaries that showed footage of them doing that. It was very interesting. So don't take my word for it. Like, go read a book, go watch a documentary, listen to interviews from the writers. They all state that this is clearly the case. Now, to be fair, I was going to make this argument with the comment, but because I hold all my comments for approval, because in case it's a troll. But once I approved this comment and I was ready to respond to it, it disappeared. So either I accidentally hit the wrong button and deleted it when I didn't. I never intended to, because I wasn't going to delete it because I really wanted to respond to it. Or the user who posted it deleted it themselves. Maybe they looked it up and realized that what I was saying was true. But that's what I hoped the case was. And even though I was a little bit offended for them calling it bullshit, it was more of a point of, if you do any research, you can see, do the research yourself. You can clearly see that what I'm saying is the truth. Watch, I think it was one of the DVD bonus features with Michael Piller of All Good Things, where he clearly stated he came up with the idea while doing yoga. But anyway, sorry. That's a long aside. and I'm not saying anything against you, Stephen, for not knowing that he came up with the idea, because Brennan Braga is the credited writer for the episode. But anyway, I'm sure he took what he did with this episode and sort of helped him guide him with All Good Things. In fact, the original idea of this episode was to have Picard to be the main character, which I'm glad they didn't do, because then All Good Things would have been too similar. Maybe they wouldn't have done All Good Things. It was this is too similar to the episode we did with him earlier with the parallel universes. So I'm glad they did Worf, because now the episodes are different. They're not very similar at all, where had Picard been in this episode, it would have been too similar. And also, I like how they did Worf as the main character, because he seems an unlikely character, the grumpy security guy who wants to destroy everything. And also, as per your comment about Worf, you don't believe that he would win a bat-lift fight. Look, there's plenty of episodes, even in TNG, like when he killed Duras, for example. There's plenty of episodes where they show Worf being a badass, where they show him being a good fighter. I love that. It was the episode Violations, when that guy tried to attack Worf and he just went, poof, bitch slapped him and knocked him out with one slap. I love that. So they can show Worf being a badass. The problem is, and I just chalked this up to bad writing, because I think in-universe Worf is not a weakling. He's not a bad fighter. It's just bad writing, because they use it as a cheat when they want to be lazy. It's lazy writing more than bad writing. It's when they want to be lazy, because they use it as a shorthand to, this villain's a badass because he can kick Worf's ass. But the problem is, if you do that too much, then it makes Worf look like a putz, which unfortunately is what they did. They were trying to do it as a shorthand to, oh my god, this guy can even beat Worf, so he's a serious badass villain. Yeah, but you can't do it too much, and otherwise you just lose belief in the fact that Worf is a badass, and then it becomes meaningless. But I try to look past that, because I know that's just the writers being lazy. Anyway, spent enough time on that comment. Move on to the next one, which is from Kyrie091, who says, parallels, more like it barely smells. Because this episode isn't bad. It barely smells. It's actually quite pleasant. You know, I do like Kyrie091 when you try to explain your puns and try to make them fit with the episode better, or get us to see, no, seriously, this pun fits. But no, in this case, I'll agree with you there. Anyway, next comment is from Antarius, who says, this is certainly one of the episodes I've seen the most often. I like that Wesley returned in this episode. It would have been really great if Tasha Yar was alive in one universe. And I even would have liked to see Pulaski again. Worf could have passed through a universe in which the Enterprise has a massive tribal problem, or a universe where Morn was part of the Enterprise crew, or a universe where the exocomps have taken over the Enterprise. I could go on forever. The bad thing about this episode, the focus on Worf-Troi relationship. My rating is a 9 out of 10. You know, as I said, actually, even though I don't like the Worf-Troi relationship, I didn't mind it in this episode, as I said, because it's weird parallel universe stuff. I think the bad thing about this episode is the fact no one gave a shit that Geordi died. But that's what I would point to. But, you know, it was the original idea to have Tasha Yar instead of Wesley, but then they rejected that idea because they thought it would be too similar to yesterday's Enterprise. And you know what? I actually agree with them. I heard a lot of people disagreeing, saying, no, it would have been fine. I think they're right, actually. I think it was kind of more novel to have Wesley, to see if he never, maybe graduated the academy, maybe in this parallel universe, he never did the Daredevil stunt with Nick Locarno. Maybe he never joined Nova Squadron, or if he did, maybe he was smart enough to be like, no, fuck you, Nick, we're not doing this, it's too dangerous. And so he never had to repeat a year of the academy, and so he graduated on time, and then by this time joined Starfleet. Although in this episode he's a lieutenant, which he wouldn't have graduated until like the year before this, so he would still be an ensign. So maybe it was he went to the academy earlier. Maybe in this universe, the episode Coming of Age, maybe he actually passed the test instead of Murdoch, and he went to the academy straight away in season 1. So he finished, by season 5, and so by now he's a lieutenant. Yeah, I'm going with that one. But anyway, I think there's a possibility they could have showed them both. They could have showed Wesley and Tasha Yar in a different universe, not the same one. And here's the thing, like, as much as I like your ideas with tribbles, and especially Morn, fuck yes, Morn on the Enterprise, oh my god, they definitely should have done that, 100%. But as much as I like your ideas with the exocomps and the tribbles and all that, it gets back to what I was saying about how the novelty of this episode is that each universe that Worf goes to is not all that different than our own universe. There's only slight difference, like there's different uniforms, the painting was hanging on a different wall, or the cake was a different flavor, like the tiny little details. Now it does get bigger, the differences do expand more, and we finally get to the one with Riker being the captain and Wesley being there and Cardassians being the allies and Bajorans being the enemies. But anything with like tribbles and exocomps everywhere, that's even weirder than that. So this is the biggest extreme, so you don't want to go to all these other big extremes. It's kind of the novelty of the episode, but I will admit that would have been nice. But I see what they're going for with this episode. So anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, Parallels is definitely one of my favorite TNG episodes. It is interesting that Brennan Braga once had a grasp of the high concept episode in TNG Cause and Effect, Timescape, Frame of Mind, and Parallels, and in Voyager Projections Timescape. Probably not me. Oh, sorry. And Voyager projections. Sorry, I thought you were going to name more Voyager episodes. No, but in Voyager projections. Timescape, Frame of Mind, and Parallels were probably the most flawless. Cause and Effect had a lingering Dr. Frasier ending, and Projections had an unnecessary psych out at the end. Of course, he also has hit issues as a showrunner. The first 2 seasons of Enterprise, threshold issues of disregarding continuity with Joe Manowski on Borg episodes, and in general an odd concept of evolution in his writing. But this episode worked well, and I really liked the choice of Worf. They could have tried Crusher again following Remember Me and Cause and Effect for the high concept. Or Troi, or Picard. Granted, we already had an alternate Picard in an excellent episode in the previous season. I would have had fun and somehow thrown in Kalar, but alas, the writers wanted to push a Troi and Worf ship, which for the individual episode, I admit, does work. Sorry, I lost my spot. But I think pushing it the rest of the season and putting in all good things, his one did not work. Still, the whole cleverness of, at first, mild shifts between universes, followed by greater ones, and playing around with the Cardassians and Bajorans, including having a Cardassian ensign in one universe up front, and the whole tour de force at the end with all those Enterprises showing up and calling each other. It was brilliant, and it will continue to, and I will continue to give it 10 true champion trophies out of 10. Yeah, I didn't really like Projections. I'll get to that episode when I get to Voyager, but I didn't. That one was just too crazy. Like, it got too ridiculous. Maybe you mentioned you didn't like the ending, but I didn't really like any of that episode. Like, I don't know. It was just too out there, too crazy. But yeah, you bring up the first 2 seasons of Enterprise as bad, Brennan Berger. But the funny thing is that he keeps talking about how he's known as the high concept person. I hear other people refer to him as the high concept writer for the episodes you just mentioned: Timescape, Frame of Mind, Parallels, Cause and Effect. But he didn't do any of that in the first 2 seasons of Enterprise, and I think that's what was missing. Like, I wanted to have more. I mean, they did the whole temporal Cold War thing, but that was kind of, it wasn't really like this mind-bending high-concept shit that Braga is known for. And that was the problem. He got away from doing that kind of things. And also, I would also throw in Year of Hell. In that category of the high concept. It wasn't really mind-bending, but it definitely played with time. So, yeah, I would definitely throw that in there as well. But, yeah, the threshold you bring up, because he was also known as the body horror guy, doing stuff like Identity Crisis, which was his first solo episode, and what was the other one? Genesis. A lot of people don't like, but then Threshold people dislike even more. And then on Enterprise was that one in season 3. I think it called Evolution. I can't remember what the hell that. It doesn't matter. The episode sucked. So a lot of people hated that. So he seemed to not have as good a track record with his body horror stuff, which I was never into that genre in the first place. So I never really liked any of it. Although I do like Genesis better than most people. I will say that was the one I thought that was successful. I liked it even more than Identity Crisis, but that is just me. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, "This episode is amazing and one of my favorites of TNG. I especially loved it that it was Worf who was experiencing the different universes and not somebody like Data or Geordi, and it was extremely fascinating, and I love towards the end that we get to see the many different Enterprises and crew members. The one thing I say I wasn't a fan of was the Troi and Worf romance, although to be fair, it wasn't a full-blown romance like what will unfortunately happen towards the end of the season, but not enough to damage this episode, and this episode exemplifies why Season 7 is indeed a great season. So my rating is a 10 out of 10. Yeah, I would have liked Data and Troi romance more, but it wouldn't have worked in this episode. Because I agree that Worf needs to be the center. Like, you definitely can't have Data. Like, that totally wouldn't work, because Data wouldn't be that confused by it. He would just be like, non-emotion reactions. It would not be interesting. Troi would be better, but I think, than Data, at least. But I think Worf is definitely the best option. And as I said, I don't mind the Worf Troi romance, but they should have contained it to this one episode. Because it's a weird parallel universe. I'm fine with weird parallel universes, but they shouldn't have brought it back in our universe. That's all I'm saying. Alright, so final comment is from Brandon Neal Howes, who says, I like this episode. Worf is comedy gold, as usual. I don't like surprise parties, and I really don't like the Worf and Troi romance. Who gets a prize for coming 9th? That's just silly. Geordi gets killed and nobody shows any emotion. The new console looks so fake, I wouldn't know how to use it either. I don't understand how Worf is on the original Enterprise. Doesn't that fuck up the timelines? The Borg have taken over other Riker's universe. Well, damn, that might just be the best use of the Borg in TNG. 8 blue-eyed androids out of 10. A lot of people, I just found out that Data had blue eyes. I never noticed the color of people's eyes. That's just something I never noticed. Period. Real life television, whatever. And so when people pointed it out to me and I looked for it, I was like, oh yeah, Data does have blue eyes. How about that? But I would never notice. You make a really good point about coming in 9th place. Who gets, especially Klingons. Like, Klingons wouldn't really give, 9th place statues. They'd be like, oh, you loser. Like, I don't know. That doesn't seem to fit at all. But as for what different Worf is doing on the original Enterprise, I answered this earlier in my review. It's cascade effect. Anyway, Worf is definitely comedy gold in this episode. And it's not too distracting of a comedy. It's like the subtle that works with the episode. It reminds me of what my sister said about Star Trek comedy, is that it works best when it's just slightly tossed into like serious episodes, rather than trying to do an entire episode of comedy that never works in Star Trek. Lower Decks, of course, being a huge exception, but outside of Lower Decks, whenever they try to devote an episode to comedy, be it Luoxana and Troi or Ferengis, doesn't work. But when they slip it in other good episodes, then it does work. Anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for Parallels out of 10, I was actually divided on what to give this episode, whether I should give it a 9 or a 10. But you know what? Especially after talking it over, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt and give it a 10 out of 10. The best. Now, the reason why I hesitate on my 10, I know some of my Patreon supporters gave it a 10, some gave it a 9. I think there was a couple 8s in there too. But the reason why I was kind of hesitant to give it a 10 is because there's this kind of bland feeling. It's hard to describe. It's hard to put into words, because I wouldn't call this episode bland because it's so fascinating with the parallel universes. And there is a good character story with Worf being doubted and having to overcome his doubts, but something about the way the characters are performed and the emotional value seems a little bit muted. And I actually find that to be true of a lot of these Brennan Braga concept episodes, except for Frame of Mind. But like Cause and Effect and Timescape it seems there, even though I love those episodes, especially Timescape, there seems to be a kind of muted emotion and more of going through the paces. And I definitely had that feeling here, which made me consider giving it a 9. But the more I think about it, the more I think, no, this episode's really original. It's very thought-provoking. It really gets the imagination juices going. And it was brilliant the way they used Worf. I actually didn't have a problem with Troi romance in this episode only. I didn't have a problem with it. And, the biggest complaint I had that they killed Geordi off and nobody gave a shit. But that's not that big of a complaint. And the bland feeling I was feeling, also not that big of a deal, because it's just a weird abstract feeling that I can't really articulate. So it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't, to me, I finally decided it's not enough to hold this episode back from getting a 10. 10 out of 10, definitely top tier TNG. So that is it for my review of Parallels. So if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, leave a comment. What do you think about Parallels? Is it 10 out of 10 or is it only 8 out of 10? Those are your only options. Just kidding. Whatever you think, you can let me know in the comments section. And if you'd really like to support the channel, you could support me on Patreon. There'll be a link in the description below. The different tiers for different budgets. There's different rewards, such as a Patreon exclusive series of videos that I do where I revisit reviews that I already made that's exclusive to Patreon supporters. And you can leave comments for me to include in my videos like I just did, and pre-releases, request video for me to do, stuff like that. You can check it out for the different options. But if that's not your thing, Patreon is just not your thing, then you can still help out the channel by leaving a like, subscribing, that sort of thing is all very helpful as well. So let's see what's coming up next on the old channel here. So Monday will be my review for Sanctuary. Wednesday will be my review for Rivals. Thursday I'll be reviewing Lower Decks Season 5 Episode 7. And then on Saturday I'll be reviewing the TNG episode, The Pegasus. So that's what's coming up on my channel. So be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Lower Decks and many other shows as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.